The most potent line of attack from radical gender theory is the discipline's assault on so-called sexual normativity. And you see this throughout the academic literature, throughout all the various subfields that have been inspired by the general thrust of queer theory. So you have queer theory itself, which provides a ruthless criticism of what it calls the cis-normative society, the hetero-normative society, and the male-female gender binary that underpins it. Of course, all the related fields like fat studies, which can be considered a derivative of this, provide a ruthless criticism of healthy human proportion. Disability studies, which is another subfield, provides a criticism of well-adjusted and psychologically integrated people. The idea being that these are norms promoted by society, reinforced by the social system, reinforced by the economic system of capitalism, that appear to be oriented towards health, towards reproduction, towards psychological integration, but in fact are used as a mechanism of oppression against other non-normative groups, people who don't fit into the gender binary, for example, or to the heteronormative social ideal type. And so if you break down this argument, what do you get? Well, I think that queer theory actually makes an implicit two-part argument. On the surface, you have a relativistic argument. It says, well, these are arbitrary social constructs, and in fact, society can prioritize either normative or non-normative at will. There's no human hierarchy that is inevitable, but in fact, these are all reproduced through oppressive systems and should be ruthlessly interrogated, deconstructed, because ultimately, at heart, none of them have a monopoly on human value. The second part of the argument, though, which is hidden and implicit, is an absolutist argument. Because, in fact, they're not saying that everything is relative and therefore there should be no hierarchy. There should be no one set of values above any other set of values. But operating under the surface of this is the desire to achieve the hegemony of the non-normative. So to displace the old society with what might be called a queer normative society, a fat normative society, a mentally ill normative society. And so the two-part operation of this argument is, in a sense, relativism against the enemy and absolutism in the interests of the friend. And the goal isn't tolerance and pluralism, which you often hear deployed as a surface-level rhetorical argument, but it's actually to achieve an inversion, and to achieve a hegemony of the non-normative ideal, which you see valorized in the academic literature on all these different axes, whether it's gender, sexuality, body type, or psychological health. And you can see that this is actually working in our society. You see a huge explosion in the adoption of queer normative identities, especially among young people, and you see them wielding this cultural power in order to slowly re-engineer society as a whole. You see, for example, in advertisements, a composition of sexual identities that is not representative of the general population's kind of normal distribution curve. You see in shopping malls now, you have advertisements that are featuring the obese models, so they're trying to normalize what they say is like equality of all shapes and sizes is the top line rhetoric, but you see a kind of normalization of something that for really most of human history, especially in the West, would not fit into that normal distribution curve of human proportion. And even in Victoria's Secret advertisements on their runway shows, they've replaced the Victoria's Secret angels, kind of very beautiful specimens of feminine beauty. And now you have even biological men as the swimsuit models for Victoria's Secret kind of ideal type of women. And so you see a change. You see something that is flipping the normativity on its head. And on the psychological side, a lot of people that I've seen in social media platforms now identify themselves proactively, not just by gender pronouns, including neo-pronouns like they, them, ze, zim, zer, her, but also categorize themselves and use the designations of mental illness diagnoses. So actually quite proudly and in a quite forward way, saying, ADHD, bipolar, borderline, PTSD, or whatever the designation might be. People are using these not as a challenge or a psychological challenge to be overcome or to be treated, but actually as a marker of a non-normative identity that is then valorized and elevated as superior to a kind of simple, plain, vanilla, normative identity representing a kind of golden mean of psychological integration. And so the key thing to understand here is that these are not identities that you would think of as traditional kind of racial or sexual or religious identities. These are political identities. And in fact, the bait and switch from queer theory is precisely this. They're taking what are, on the surface, gender identities or sexual identities, and they're transforming them into a political identity that has a valence that in some cases are related to, but in many other cases is not related to, the underlying or the spoken sexual identity. And I think that the goal here is, again, to subvert the original hierarchy, to subvert the traditional hierarchy, not to create, in a sense, a non-normative society, meaning not to create something in which is a kind of relativistic construct that has, no one system has any more value than another, but actually an anti-normative society. And this is a really key distinction because they're reducing the idea of normativity to a plastic conception of power. And ultimately what this is, it's taking an almost kind of Marxist categorization of oppressor and oppressed along the axis of gender and sexuality. And I think what's driving a lot of this, and you can see this in the literature, you can see this in the activism, you can see this in some of the kind of unhinged and hysterical street protests, often ending up in physical violence, that they want to abolish the normative society, to tear down the normative society. And in this anti-normative society, you see also a hidden ideal type, and actually a new ideal type. And you can see it. You can see it in culture, you can see it in art, you can see it in music, you can see it throughout the especially visual representation of this movement. You see it as a perhaps gender-neutral, non-binary, obese, kind of mentally disturbed, they, them pronoun user, operating as a radically autonomous individual that is totally disconnected from any of the traditional bonds, relationships, and constraints. In a way, this is a person who, in the ideal typology, transcends the limitations of the heteropatriarchal structure, transcends the limitations of the gender binary, the male and the female, and then transcends the expectation that is imposed by society for psychological integration and psychological health. It's not designed to serve as a substitute. I don't think that even the queer theorists and the radical gender theorists can posit a replacement for a society governed on their principles. Rather, it functions almost entirely on the process of negation, dissolving, attacking, dismantling, deconstructing. Those are the verbs and the kind of loaded meaning behind all of the intellectual work and then the human work that you see as a social movement. You can think of this as a left-wing Nietzschean inversion, a total transgression of the given norms of society, and a way for the left-wing gender activists to get beyond the gender binary, to get beyond the heteropatriarchal society, and to achieve an almost purely negative form of liberation. That's ultimately the only positive value that you see embedded in the ideology. It's the idea of totally collapsing the structures that would inhibit the individual, that would tether the individual to a series of expectations, and to really shatter them and get beyond them into an almost amorphous and undefinable unknown. I think of it as almost like a kind of CHAZ, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone that they established in the city of Seattle during the George Floyd riots, which is a kind of area of complete kind of liberation, where there are no rules, where none of the conventions have to be honored. And even though this kind of social structure, I think, is inevitably short-lived, it has a very short half-life before it disintegrates. I think that is the ideal towards which this movement is pointing. And so, what are the problems with this? I mean, on the surface, I think everyone has a visceral and intuitive sense that something is going awry, something is going sideways here. The ultimate problem is that a society based on an anti-normative ideal will eventually fail. It's something that is fundamentally unstable. It has a self-devouring standard. And so, for the most simple and basic example, if your ideal type is non-binary, you end up not having any kind of reproductive function. You have to have men and women in order to reproduce the species. And so if you've transcended those categories into a kind of non-binary normative society, this is, again, it's self-devouring, it's self-extinguishing, because it negates the basic property of human nature, again, human birth, if we take the Latin term. It cannot achieve that standard because it's explicitly against that standard. And so the question then is, well, why has queer theory or radical gender theory succeeded? I think in part because it successfully deployed a stigma against the articulated defense of the normative society. It's considered a taboo to provide an explicit intellectual defense of heterosexuality, biological sex, the gender binary, the two-parent family, psychological integration. And consequently, you see very little intellectual output defending those systems, defending those hierarchies. And people, for a very, very long time, have simply accepted them tacitly. And if we want to be fair to the gender theorists, they've been successful in undermining those certainties, in bringing that system up to the surface, and in providing a critique that creates doubt and then creates a taboo against the counter-argument, which again has always just been accepted as fact. So where do we find ourselves today? I think we're in the midst of a really significant moral fight. We're fighting about the basic building blocks of society, the basic nature of reality. And you have in one camp the normative defense. You have in another camp the kind of anti-normative attack. And the question is, well, will one prevail or will there be some kind of accommodation? I think the best answer is to create a generally normative society with space and respect for people who don't automatically fit into those categories, but recognizing that, for example, the sex binary is fundamental. It's unchanging. It's universal. So if you look around at what's happening in society, I think you have a short-term momentum on behalf of the kind of forces of anti-normativity. But ultimately, I think that that campaign will fail. It could cause a lot of damage in the short run. It could have some unexpected benefits in the short run. But ultimately, I think that reality and human nature will always reassert themselves. And if you take the kind of standard distribution curve and you say that we're maybe skewing it one direction or another, over time there will be a reversion to the mean. There will be a return to what is a kind of universal human standard. And this doesn't mean that you can simply give up or leave society up to fate. There is, again, to a large extent, social construction matters. It's how we live, it's how we speak, it's how we operate in the real world. But the ultimate goal is to create a society that respects the basic laws of human nature, that provides equal dignity for people who don't automatically fit those categories of masculinity and femininity, but orienting a society that is going to establish a hierarchy of values that leads towards a notion of the transcendent, towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. And to the extent that the kind of campaign of queer theory and radical gender theory and its anti-normative ideal is antithetical to that, it's important for people to resist it. It's important for people to challenge it openly. And I think it's really important that we don't dismiss these simple questions as silly or arbitrary or kind of verbalistic. No, we have to debate all these questions. And when they say something like the gender binary, we can't simply kind of dismiss it out of hand. We actually want to dig into it and explain what it is. And so that's really the task ahead. But if we can engage in the debate, if we can take these questions seriously and provide better answers, I think we can get to a point where our social nature and our cultural nature is consonant with the nature of the underlying reality. And that's ultimately where we want to be. We want to have a society that respects the fundamental nature of reality, of human sexuality, of human reproduction, but also provides a space and provides equal dignity for people who don't automatically fit into those ideal types or the masculine and feminine types. And so this will not be easy. It's going to require us to dig deep. It's going to require us to fight. But I think ultimately we're going to get there.